Hola, buenos días. Buenos días.
Hello, good morning, everyone. We're going to begin with the last session in this meeting.
La más importante.
Last but not least, because this might be the most important session that we're having, we're going to try and draw some conclusions of all of the things that have been discussed here. And it's going to be extremely difficult because we've spoken about many topics, all of them very interesting. But for that, we have the wonderful rapporteurs that have been working very hardly in these last days, and they have assisted and participated in this session. So today, we're going to have then presenting the conclusions that they reached from the previous sessions. Then we'll break for coffee in order to get some inspiration, and afterwards we'll project the text of the declaration, which is only a draft, and we'll introduce some of the aspects included within the conclusions, but we'll open the floor for the debate, so you can give us some feedback and you can express your ideas so we can have a better draft for the final document. So without further ado,
A Kerstin, que nos va a...
I'm going to be calling Dresden, who's going to tell us about the first session that was more related with World Heritage Site. Good morning, everybody. First, I wanted to say that I'm going to be doing my presentation in English, because I think we're going to have some others in Spanish, and for those of us who are following this in English, is going to be much easier. This has been a very interesting meeting, and these are the conclusions of the first session of the Monday morning session. But what was really interesting was to see that all of the points that were mentioned in this first session have been repeated afterwards, and they have been discussed again.
To start my presentation, just to remind you of the title that it had, but well, we were all talking about cultural landscapes in the urban context and World Heritage, with very spectacular case studies, starting with Madrid, which is our host here, and also the reason why we are gathered here with a recently inscribed site, and learning how Madrid is now starting to implement everything they have been hardly working on. They have been working on very hard to become World Heritage. All the planning and coordination mechanisms which will now be put in place and will now have to stand the test of time a little bit. And we also learned in one of the discussions that there is already a project ongoing that will be the occasion to test the different coordination mechanisms, which are very well in place here between the three different levels, the city of Madrid, the Comunidad Autónoma of Madrid, and also, of course, the national government. We then heard about Central Park, which is since 2017 on the tentative list of the United States of America. And we delved into some aspects of ecosystem services. I will come back to that later on. We learned that there are 20,000 trees that are considered as delivering ecosystem services, so to take up this aspect very, very strongly. And we also learned from Patricia O'Donnell, who presented the case, that there are certainly also still aspects to develop in the elaboration of the statement of outstanding universal value, to look into social aspects and others. I will come back to that later. Just to give you an overview of the different types of cities we looked at. We then had a presentation of Wataru Ono on the historic monuments of ancient Kyoto, which is a site much longer inscribed already, with a long experience in management, which is set up 15 years ago, a strengthened landscape management system with particularly featuring Kyoto as compared to Tokyo, which he also presented us as a very interesting comparison case. So here in Kyoto we have height limitations, and we have also landscape design aspects with view sheds much more strongly put in place to be able to protect these serial sites in such a large metropolitan area. And last but not least, we heard about Rio de Janeiro and the Carioca landscapes, which is a very dynamic place, which, as you can see also here in the map, has taken deliberately out the residential, the built-up areas to focus on the interchange between the mountain and the sea. And we heard about this in more detail. So I'm just to say that, yeah, the keywords all came up in all the keywords that we always use. So of course, values about the outstanding universal value, but also all the other values that are in such a cultural landscape and in such an urban area. The aspect of governance came up very strongly. The question of engagement and the methods with whom, the question of buffer zones, how to go about that, and how they can serve, how they are put in place, and of course all the risks that we are facing. It went from the challenges of the complexity of daily management to the conservation in the face of all the global crises that we have, starting with a climate crisis in particular. And we also heard about a strong appeal to enhance the connectivities, culture, nature in an urban dense area where we now have these urban parks, which are important public spaces. Also the tangible, intangible. It was said very clearly that there's no way of managing a site, and Wataru for Kyoto made that point very clearly. There's no way of managing a site without taking into account, of course, the intangible values and, of course, the people, how to address, how to have them interact, how to listen to them. So these were important aspects. So for the values, also again, Wataru underlined that it's so important to understand the values as a necessary basis for the commitment to protection and management. And in his case of Kyoto, which had to do a retrospective statement of outstanding universal value, it was also interesting to see how the discovering the value also came up with additional aspects, and that it was not so easy to work on this, but it's a process, and that's also the other point that came up very strongly, that we have processes and processes and people to bring together in this territorial context that we are talking about here. And the governance, of course, the need for continuity at political decision-taking level, that's a wish, I think, which is, of course, a continuity which is not always the case, which means also a continuity in always giving the best information for informed decision-making. Then the questions of priorities, that can also become a question of conflict of interest, obviously. The question of engagement, who communicates what with whom and when, or who listens to whom when, and what is coming out of that is very important. Also the aspect of having people in, appreciate the place that we see as all the cultural and natural values, but that people live in or use every day, and how this enjoyment can be also negotiated, or can be a basis for identifying also limits of acceptable change. That is very important, that came up in many of these aspects. Of course, these places, urban, cultural landscapes, can be places of recreation, are places of recreation, of healthy lifestyles, of also, of course, microclimate for our warming cities in particular, but also for lifelong learning. I've called it lifelong learning. We always talk about education. I think it's much more from all ages and at all times that we can learn in and from these places and from each other. And last but not least, the aspect of ecosystem services that these places can deliver should be considered, and as landscape conservation can be a part of the solutions to those global challenges that we are facing, that in case of interventions that are necessary, priority should be given to low carbon interventions, and that, as I already said, urban cultural landscapes should contribute to enhancing the quality of life, the resilience, and also social cohesion, ideally. And then, Patricia, I took up your appeal for the cultural landscapes, for the planetary rights. So I think this is something that you might want to bring in the discussion later on as well. These are my points. I just wanted to, since we were talking at the local and national management and coordination level, also add one additional 50 years anniversary to the one that Michtel had mentioned yesterday, because there's also the recommendation that was approved at the same time as the convention, and it's very important to look into this aspect of using the recommendation at the national level to enhance cultural and natural heritage protection. There are some very interesting aspects already at that time. Of course, we knew that they were already forward-thinking. The aspect, the mention that it should be considered in its entirety and as an homogeneous whole and not be dissociated from its environment. So with this, I stop here and thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Kerstin.
Thank you very much, Kerstin. I think you've done a wonderful summary of all the things that were discussed, and now we're going to have María del Pozo summarizing this wonderful session that we had with so many interesting things talking about the historic cities as landscape.
Buenos días. Bueno, antes, como no.
Good morning. Before we begin, I would like to congratulate the City Council of Madrid for this first meeting, and the Technical Scientific Director, Monica, because I think during this day it's been able to gather many experts, and we've been able to express the very interesting problems that we're going to have ahead of us in the scope of cultural and urban landscape. With regards to the last session, for which I've been the rapporteur, we dealt with urban landscape, and the different presentations of the speakers help us to see from a more conceptual and theoretical perspective the one offered by the recommendation of urban historic landscape to go into very practical issues with the feet on the ground, as Mr. Bandarin said, with management examples provided by historical Regis network, as well as with the network of cities practice together with Patricia O'Donnell and Marino L. In that sense, we need to highlight that we started with the Historical Garden Network, Regis, and what they call their mission, their purpose. The approach of this organization has helped them to group several gardens with the purpose of optimizing human and economic resources so we can better defend and give value their historical, architectonic, environmental, landscaping, and urban heritage. In this set of historical gardens, achieving the commitment of public and private institutions, but above all, looking for local society to identify themselves with this heritage as an indispensable element in order to improve their quality of life. Amongst the activities that they highlighted and that I consider important, we go through a very broad range. Educational activities aimed at the little children, also scientific and cultural activities with the creation of archives, laboratories, promoting international congresses and meetings. This setting up a long-term strategy that materializes in a management plan for this set of gardens, and this is an example that we can use. But apart from these best practice examples that was presented to us by our friends from Regis, in this session we saw some key issues, some gaps that we still have. In the practice, we identify the word landscape in areas that are more rural. We think that landscape is equivalent to rural landscape, and cities are not managed as urban landscape, despite the recommendations that we have in 2012 and that were further developed in Rio in 2013. The case of Spain talked about this, saying that cities are living organisms with people and monuments that need to find a balance between the preservation and the development of the daily life, apart from facing the challenge of having this urban landscape overcoming the limitations that we have, and including some environmental and social aspects that are not included within the statement. And very often these new things that we are included are hard to manage in the day-to-day life of the city. When we talk about cultural landscapes that are part of the World Heritage, the management of the territory and all of its characteristics, material and immaterial, it is inherent to the definition of this type of goods, but still the specificity of every cultural landscapes makes very complicated to follow general guidelines in the management of it. We see certain considerations as who is going to lead the integral management, how can we reconcile the different regulations that are applicable, the protection of biodiversity, the protection of the underwater heritage in some cases, the protection of the heritage, how we incorporate the immaterial or intangible asset protection available. The different regulations in the countries needs to become a true operational tool. In the case of Spain, this is a paradigm, because we see different types of legislations that overlap in the cultural landscapes, but to that we add the difference between the local, regional, and central administrations. The recommendations of 2011 might give us an answer to these questions. And they do so by promoting the commitment of the local community, encouraging good governance in cultural landscapes through knowledge, awareness, and planning. Also by providing economic resources and creating new legislative tools that will defend and regulate the protection of the asset. And in this session, we also heard that maybe we could add a little bit more to this recommendation, which is the possibility of giving a voice to those who traditionally have never been considered in decision making. That means to integrate very actively communities. Michael Turner said that the world is made up by mainly urban spaces, and therefore the management of urban landscape becomes really relevant. The Sustainable Development Goals encourages us and poses a challenge in the management of these cultural landscapes, because we need to do that in a holistic way and taking into consideration multiple perspectives, and all of this done in the scenario of the climate change that poses many challenges on our day-to-day. But how do cities and urban landscape face these type of challenges? The mayor from Segovia said that they look for areas of convergence between the preservation and the development of the city, taking into consideration sustainable development goals in the planning and in the management tools that we use on a daily basis, and taking into consideration people and promoting citizen participation. And to finish, we have to see how we visualize our cultural landscapes and how do we going to see them in the future. The future cannot be understood without understanding the heritage that identify us. So we need to have a comprehensive approach to the management. Changes that understand cultural landscapes as a unity, as a whole. Very often the cities know the cross-cutting aspects of of heritage more than the managers, more than all the other things. Sustainable development goals see the heritage as a means, not as an end, a means or as a tool that can propitiate social, economic, and environmental development. These new considerations of the role that heritage can play in the current scenario makes us think that maybe we should reconsider the statement, because it separates natural and heritage or cultural landscapes, and we have to adapt this declaration in such a way that adapts better to the new challenges and including the synergies that the cultural and natural heritage can have in other UNESCO designations, such as Biosphere Reserve, etc. To finish, I believe that the challenge is in the table. Society obliges to see that we have to take measures according to the needs and changing life considerations. The pandemic has exacerbated the demands and is potentiating a new approach for the cities. This is seen when we see the appearance of digital nomads who are running away from cities in many cases and go to live in rural areas, so they can carry out their activities, their works, their jobs there, and maybe urban environments are not giving a response to those needs. And in these cases, the heritage, the landscapes, how we understand it and how we manage will play a very significant role, because it's going to be the very relevant tool in these changing moments. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, María.
Thank you very much, María. It was wonderful to see how our rapporteurs are capable of summarizing such dense and complicated sessions. And now we're going to hear Paloma Ramos. She had a double burden because she had to be the rapporteur for 2 sessions, very complicated sessions like the ones in which we spoke about the future challenges such as climate change, for example.
Buenos días, muchas gracias por...
Good morning, and thank you very much for all the things that I've been able to learn in these days. It was a very interesting cocktail of concepts, rational reflections that are going to lead to some conclusions that are going to be extraordinary without a doubt, and that can use as a basis for the continuity of these meetings or this international meeting on cultural landscapes. Well, in session 3, that was developed under the title Opportunities for the Future, we saw that cultural landscapes within the cities are spaces with environmental, cultural, social, and identitary values that contribute to improve the quality of life of the cities. It helps us in achieving territorial cohesion and cultural identity, but this feature makes them very fragile spaces that face very important contemporary challenges that can put their survival at risk. For example, the impact of climate change. We mentioned that in the last years we've seen floods, an increase of carbon emissions, droughts, rains or snow, increase of the temperatures, increasing of the sea level, heat waves, the modification of the natural or the animal habitat, the pandemic, forced migrations with massive displacements of populations and some violence associated to that. And all of these things have been happening in the last years in a very intense and rapid way, and this makes the management of these type of changes very difficult. Other challenges that don't have to do so much with nature, but it have to do with a human impact, globalization, massive tourism, town planning pressure, the incorporation of new technologies, new uses of the public spaces. Public spaces is being used privately, the pollution of forests and the constant uncertainty that we suffer because of the cultural, social, and economic changes that we're seeing. The cities suffer these, and they create policies. We have to evaluate these risks, and we have to create policies in order to mitigate it. We saw in this panel that it was very important to see an integral approach to adapt to climate change and to the preservation, because we see that doing this in silos is not working. We're lacking approaches, tools, and technologies. And then we have an important aspect that was mentioned, tourism. Personally, this is something that I hadn't noticed, but it was very well presented by Celia from Granada. And it says that tourism has an impact on how we perceive heritage. We're changing how we perceive the world at large. Tourist policy are not very aware and is over-exploiting certain places. And it was mentioned that the list of World Heritage, it is contributing to the over-exploitation of certain monuments. The World Heritage Center, aware of this danger, has set up a program for World Heritage and sustainable tourism. This month we will see the new International Charter of ICOMOS on cultural heritage tourism based in balancing tourist approach, so we can have an economic growth, but at the same time we will be preserving the heritage. But this will be done when we have indicators, tourist limitations, flow control, access limitations, traffic regulation. But we said that we cannot make heritage only available to certain elites, and that is why we have to potentiate the strengths of the cities and reduce and mitigate the risks and the weaknesses, fostering the sustainability and the resilience. The Green Deal also proposes strategies that will advance in the protection of the cultural heritage, mainly by stopping global warming, by achieving the decarbonation of energy, limitation to wind parks, energy efficiency solutions for historic buildings, which is very complex, but we'll have to consider. Also, we thought that it was very important, and it's also been mentioned by María when talking about the previous session, the presentation, interpretation, dissemination, and communication of heritage. This needs to be an activity that it is done with a very balanced participation in the management and decision making, and for that we need a well-trained society. Also, tourism comes with opportunities. We can have a sustainable, fair, equitative, and long-lasting development. We ask for recommendations on cultural landscapes and tourism. We already wrote one recommendation, but some member states rejected it. This was said from the audience, and now we are supporting the new charter from ICOMOS. We said that there was certain support, but we were missing an action plan and an alliance with all of the stakeholders. There are other opportunities, such as the incorporation of the citizens, which has already been mentioned, incorporating the identity and the local collective memory. We need to create identitary heritage so people feel reflected. Also, we need to develop a good relationship between the historical, artistic aspects, the landscape, and the identitary. The landscape is the system in which we are living. The value of the landscape is the whole set. Everything needs to be preserved but transform at the same time. The merely physical approach, the urban shape, came with some discrepancies with the architects, because it's a limitation if we only perceive it as such. We have to take into consideration on how it is embedded in the city, the evolution, the social organization, and we wonder what's the concept of authenticity. Maybe this is something that needs to be rethink, and we have to start thinking about the different features of the landscape, and we have to avoid the musealization of the parts of the city. We have to make of this heritage area dynamic aspects where citizens can live. And finally, we reflected on what do we mean by historic urban landscape. We thought that we have to review our working methodology. We need to be humble and we have to listen to people. We heard that in Japan, in cultural landscapes, inhabitants are accustomed to natural disasters. They've gone through many of them, and they consider the landscape as a changing thing and something that it is fragile. We have to work in the concepts and in the definitions. I thought that this was especially interesting. We spoke about cultural landscape, urban historical landscape, only landscape. Monica, in fact, defended the word landscape alone, without any surname associated to it. We said that nature and human beings are considered as different entities, whereas as human beings, we are part of nature. In Rio 2013, we proposed urban cultural landscape, but at the end, it was ruled out. Some people here defended to use the word landscape and right to landscape that we all are part of. This was in the session 3 that we spoke about the future opportunities. Those who were there, we had a very dynamic roundtable with many interventions from the floor. Then we went into session 4 that took place in the afternoon, and we spoke about future challenges. Most of the topics had already been discussed, not only in the morning session but on previous days. But there was a presentation that was done about the landscape of light, the city of Madrid, and we saw the specific challenges in the landscape of light, tourism, the multiple institutions in charge that are important, traffic, noise, pollution, the impact of the island of heat, biodiversity at risk, the drought, light pollution, complex mobility, public spaces that are very deficient, accessibility issues, the lack of waste management, and we also saw some proposals for the improvement, looking for energy efficient with capturing of water and water treatment, pedestrian connectivity, creating climate refuges, achieving sustainable mobility, fostering circular economy, local production, taking into consideration citizen participation, compensation of carbon emissions and carbon sequestration, promotion of the ecologic transition, sustainable tourism. And we spoke about something that was really interesting, that was linked with some of the things that were said in the morning, using the equipment and the public spaces as laboratory for public innovation of climate policies. We saw in the morning the example of Ireland with some small islands located to the west that were used as a lab of what was coming some years later in the big island that was Ireland. And it is good to have this idea of using these spaces as labs where we can research and reflect and to see how things are going to happen in other bigger places. These islands connected with the ocean showed us what was going to happen later on. in the bigger island, the country of Ireland. Also, we said that we needed a master plan for the tree-lined boulevards in the landscape of light, because we heard that some of the tree species were going to disappear, like in the case of Amsterdam. Some species are not going to be able to adapt to the drought, and therefore they're going to end up disappear. This is going to happen, and we cannot stop it. Also, it is necessary to work in the transformation of the way we're working in the administration. We need to follow a roadmap towards climate neutrality, and we have to take into consideration social heritage, health, and well-being for the people. And we need to have a radical change in the relation that exists between people and cars. We have to communicate, we have to teach. We gave very curious examples, such as not having bad weed but spontaneous weeds.
That is very interesting. The issue of planters and ornamental greenery, whether that makes sense or not. Also, here it was mentioned that parks shouldn't be shut down. These are the islands that citizens have to combat heat waves, drought, pollution. And someone here in the room also said that roads are not shut down because there's traffic accidents. We just need to inform people about the potential risks, but you shouldn't just shut down the parks. They need to remain as shelters. And a general conclusion of this last part of the session mentions that we are landscapes. Before, we fed from nature, but now we need to care and protect it, to care for it and protect it. The different changes that are happening, as we mentioned in the beginning, are more intense. They're more difficult to manage. Ancient cities and ancient populations were based on the use of traditional materials, and they were more resilient. We no longer are so resilient. Finally, we mentioned that we had to be responsibly optimistic, and that technicians and politicians, to have a bit of a divide. It's important to have the support of politicians in management. Now, maybe we should show to them the different scenarios that we will have to face in 20 or 50 years' times, when we will no longer have many species. Hopefully, not the human race, but we will for sure lack many vegetable and wildlife species. We said that the landscape of light hasn't seen its physiognomy change a lot in the last years, but its use has changed markedly. So we need to talk about the social change. We need to raise awareness. We need to raise awareness amongst the youth and foster education. And finally, it was mentioned that 30 years have gone by since we came up with the definition of cultural landscapes. In indigenous languages, the lake, the sea, the mountain, they're neighbors. They have life. In the Anglo-Saxon language, which is spoken by a majority of participants in this encounter too, those are objects. The sea, the mountain, they are depicted as objects. So we need to go back to nature and establish the idea that humans and nature are inseparable. That's the conclusion of this session. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Paloma. Yo creo que has hecho.
Thank you very much, Paloma. I think that was a very lengthy summary of everything that was discussed here, but in spite of all the challenges and threats and the potential impacts, it seems like there's a bit of optimism in the room, and if we can tackle this, we might be on time because there's solutions. And now we'll give the floor to Miguel Vega, who was the rapporteur for the session that focused on management, which is one of the most difficult topics to tackle. Good morning. First, congratulations. Congratulations to the City Council of Madrid for organizing this event, and congratulations to Mónica Luengo, the coordinator. It's been an honor to partake in this. I'd like to thank you for inviting me. And in a way, I do this also on behalf of the Foundation of the School of Architects of Madrid. I'm going to try and summarize the conclusions of the 5th session. And I'm going to try to do it because there was a series of aspects that were raised. They were all very interesting. There were examples of many kinds, locations, sites, promoters, and it makes it difficult to actually come to a conclusion. And of course, in addition, and very logically, many of the matters that were tackled also emerged in other sessions, so I apologize for the overlap. Initially, we can say that there's guidelines that must be borne in mind to manage landscape, but each case is unique and singular, and it's precisely its outstanding value which actually makes them eligible to be part of the list of World Heritage. As was mentioned by Jörg Haspel, in the same landscape, we can see very many values, as was depicted by the case of Berlin. 112 cultural landscapes have been declared. Approximately 10% of them are rural, and there's a mixed cultural and natural values, as was reminded to us by Mechtil Rossler. There are some basic principles that must be borne in mind when managing a cultural landscape. I included 8 of them. There could be a few more or less, depending on how you regard the outcome of yesterday's session. A cultural landscape cannot be separated from natural, social, political, and economic landscape. The cultural landscape changes the life of its inhabitants and can contribute to improve it. All actions on landscape must be transparent from the outset, based on the dialogue between the different stakeholders, the government, and the local communities, joining efforts, respecting the different interests in taking on responsibility, establishing accountability. In this sense, local knowledge and planning are essential to reduce the different threats that can challenge landscapes. It's important to include local traditional practices and to foster the participation of the youth as immediate heirs of this heritage. It's important to include them in the preservation of landscape, as was also pointed out by Jyoti Hossa Graher. Preservation must be done based on respect to integrity and biodiversity. Landscapes have always changed over time, but now we can further perceive it as a consequence of climate change. This climate change will especially affect historic cities found on coastal areas, because of the increase of sea levels, and therefore we need to foresee this climate challenge and ecological challenge and adopt the necessary measures. In addition, the progressive increase in temperatures will give rise to progressive droughts, thus affecting vegetation, and this entails shutting down some areas of the landscape, in particular, for instance, trees, because of parks, because of trees falling, and because of the risk that this entails for people. This is a fact that is actually occurring across all of our cities. Nonetheless, it's not just natural events that transform landscape, but also human intervention that can give rise to large-scale changes, and at a faster pace too. We see the example of migrations and consumption patterns. It's very important to do ongoing research and to share knowledge in order to preserve the value of cultural landscapes and support its management. We need to do exchanges, transmission, and communication. An initial initiative is the creation of inventories and catalogs of the cultural landscapes that exist in the different countries and regions, and detect the ones that can have universal value, as proposed by Maguelon Dijon. The special education or professional education of specialists in heritage management is essential, and also the public administration must get involved in financing, also seen from different actions on heritage and specifically on cultural landscapes, ranging from research, education, conservation, and recovery. And the administration must incentivize institutional alliances that intend to fulfill this objective and harness the supranational funds, as expressed by Alberto Campitelli. Harmony would be the key word here, and the summary of cultural landscape management, a harmony between the idiosyncrasy of landscape and its context, between different stakeholders, between tradition and progress, between climate change and the adoption of corrective measures. A harmony between sustainable development of landscapes and tourist pressure, and between the conservation of its value and its consideration as a sort of wealth and well-being. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, Miguel, porque aparte de
Thank you very much, Miguel. You have a great quality to speak of something as difficult as management. You can approach it from such a poetic way, speaking of harmony. So thank you for doing that. And finally, David. He was in the last session. First, they presented to us that beautiful program, the Misión Región initiative. I'm very proud to take part in it. And especially this very last session that focused on the social dimension. It's essential because we constantly heard the word people, community, individuals. We've constantly heard those terms, and I think we all concur with how relevant that is. And David is therefore going to share with us the summary of this session. Thank you, David. Hello, good morning. First, thank you, Monica. You're very kind. On behalf of the region of Madrid, I'd like to thank the City Council for organizing this event and for inviting us to participate as collaborators. This perfectly fits with our line of work, with the nomination and with our personal line of work. Based on two variables that we normally follow, the Heritage Education Plan and also the landscape project that Monica pointed at. Now, about the session. I see that in this very last session, we also tried to what other colleagues also tackled. Kirsten talked about quality of life and rights. Maria talked about approaching Maria talked about approaching the landscape as a whole and a means to an end. Also, Maria mentioned that we are all the landscape, and Miguel mentioned that landscapes change the lives of people. We are all people and fit into the social dimension represented by this session. There were two initial presentation was depicted the project of Misión Región, the project of the region of Madrid. I'd like to emphasize three aspects. First, it's based on contemporary photography to approach the value of landscape as heritage. Second, the fact that it's an unprecedented initiative in Spain because of its territorial scope and because its ambition is to be all-encompassing. And also, the third point is that this is something new for heritage, to generate new heritage in this manner, to create an initiative that gives rise to compilation of photographs that will be part of our regional archives and that will help for research in the present and in the future. And of course, it'll help study the landscape that we've been discussing. We want to disseminate that message. A landscape is something that is full, it's whole in itself, and that's something that the region wants to speak about. In following with this, Carmen Rojas in the second intervention talked about the management of the landscape of life. And she broke down precisely the structure that we have in place for its management, understanding it as a whole. And she talked about the need to do an initial assessment, and also she talked about the convergence of the different competences. Rather than being a hurdle, it's a guarantee for its management. It needs to be adequately coordinated and structured, but it's a guarantee that makes sure that this is going to be adequately managed. And she also spoke of the management plan with three essential prongs. First, the idea of approaching the landscape as a whole, an integral management of this asset, and the improvement works that are taking place, that are, for instance, happening at Alcalá Gate, Puerta de Alcalá. And also she talked about governance, because knowledge transfer needs to happen in a real and effective manner. And she talked about the civic and social forum, and she talks about the transfer actions, applications, the website, and of course the visitor center that's going to open soon. And that took place before the panel, the round table, and I'm going to tackle it jointly, because our speakers managed to intertwine their ideas very well, and this gave rise to a continuum of ideas. José Fariñas spoke of a main concept, which was that participation is critical for management, thus creating a link between the different demands and doubts as to how to channel participation. He spoke of the fact that maintenance and dissemination need to work hand in hand, but he emphasized that dissemination needs to be done with the involvement of the closest environment, those people that make a living out of the asset or that live around the asset. And he also shed some doubts as to what the influence of tourism is, whether we weren't organizing more activities for tourists rather than for the neighbors, because he actually spoke of the fact that people in the nearby area are the ones that guarantee that this asset is adequately maintained, and he advocated for more activities for those people that live in the nearby area, residents, teachers, professionals that revolve around this area, because that could emphasize the idea of guaranteeing maintenance. And Elizabeth Ravik also touched upon this, connected online. She spoke of the initiative on historic urban parks, the initiative of mapping out which are the historic urban parks, thus calling for the participation of everyone who knows them and lives them, so that we can all contribute to this website that she showed to us that already included 4 examples, and each and every single one of them emphasized the value that this has for society. And she talked about a couple of elements that could have an importance. First, live history. It serves as a meeting point for those that are more vulnerable in the face of catastrophe, for instance. And she also talked about climate change suffered by parks too. This is something that we could witness during the snowstorm called Filomena here in the Retiro Park. And then from that, we need to consider who is in the right position to do the management. And therefore, Maite Meyer talked about the need to have a social perspective on this, and how necessary it is to introduce this line of thinking in our speech, because it's not about emphasizing the established powers. She was talking about the social component of that heritage management needs to include. She also focused on the fact that administrations need to play a facilitating role, and the participation rules need to be real. We need to bear in mind the minorities and the different heritages that might be forgotten. And this leads to Alicia Castillo's presentation, in which she mentioned that those of us here are a heritage community too. Therefore, we are also aligned with the ideas established by the Faro Convention in 2005, those being people who are already invested in heritage, and therefore we participate in it. But we need to be self-critical too, because we may not be duly trained as manager. It's great to have participation in place, but this requires specific professionals to get involved, psychologists, sociologists, and based on this type of reflection, she also shared her methodology, a methodology in which hearing what people have to say is very important. Interpreting discourse, interpreting the narratives, as Maite mentioned, so that this could all be translated into adequate participative processes. And that was the key idea in her intervention: participative processes as a way to get knowledge in equal conditions, in an equal level, in an equal playing ground, in a level playing field. And at the end of the discussion, Carmen Roja precisely took on board the ideas. She made this a reality through the Social and Civic and Social Council, and also did some self-criticism when talking about having a need for interdisciplinary teams, having a need for training for these teams. I think this is something that the people are calling for, but I would own it too. There's a need for larger teams, more resources, and indeed having in place a necessary structure that will allow us to perform social participation in the best way possible. That's all from me. Thank you very much.
Pues muchas gracias, David.
Thank you very much, David, for the summary of the very exciting session that we had about social participation. And now we're going to wake up a bit further by having some coffee, and with all these ideas in mind, let's go and enjoy some time together so that we can afterwards gather together to talk about the final conclusions that we will put forth, and that of course will need some subsequent drafting, but we will start talking about the main points that it shall include. So I encourage you to share some coffee together, and please get back to the room right on time. Thank you.
Vamos. Hoy estamos casi en hora.
We are almost on time today. What a miracle. Let's begin. Let's get started with this session.
Relatores.
Please, rapporteurs. You're going to have to continue to work. And we have the text on screen. We have a slight problem with blurriness. So we're going to progressively amend the text. But if I zoom in a bit more, you won't be able to read anything. So we cannot really have a general review right now, but we will discuss the different amendments that we want to introduce. So we are going to begin, and we have until 12:30. So that means we have an hour and a half so that we can work together. It's a lot of work. Well, we'll have until 12:15 because I want to take an extra quarter of an hour from you at the end of the session. So we're going to have about an hour and 15 minutes to work on this document. So I want to put forth the first challenge. This is a draft document that very honestly we put together very quickly, and thinking about a type of heritage, green historic heritage. But now after the Congress, perhaps the approach could change. So, for instance, I invite you to discuss the very title of the declaration. It was the Madrid Declaration on Urban Cultural Landscapes. But after what we have been discussing over the last few days, do you think that it's convenient to follow this title? First, I'll ask our rapporteurs. Do you think it's convenient to maintain this terminology, urban cultural landscapes? And I put forth that to our audience too. What do you think? Should we stick to this?
¿Les parece bien que mantengamos, por tanto, esta terminología?
So, is it okay to stick to this methodology? What do you think? I don't think we can hear the rapporteurs. I don't think the microphone's working. What do you think? Is it suitable? So maybe just cultural landscapes to not be so restrictive. So our rapporteurs propose to get rid of the word urban and just leave it as Madrid Declaration on Cultural Landscapes. Unfortunately, comments made without a microphone cannot be interpreted because we cannot hear them. Lería, please use the microphone. I was saying that we need to stick to urban because what actually distinguished this event from others was that we were going to work on green, historic, urban landscapes. Otherwise, we could have talked about productive landscapes or others.
Alfredo.
Aquí sí. Sí.
Hola. Sí, perdona, Mónica. Que estamos viendo que a lo mejor puede ser quizá.
We were saying that actually drawing from something that I heard from you and no one else, maybe we should get rid of the word cultural and just say urban landscapes. Okay, now we're going to give the floor to Alfredo, but the current proposal is to just stick to urban landscapes. Someone on the floor is saying historic too. I knew that this was going to spark a discussion. Okay, Alfredo. But can you hear me though? Says Alfredo. Okay, thank you. Let me apologize, but this is creating some noise for me. You know, urban cultural landscapes, I don't really see it. Let me explain. If we stick to the concept of cultural landscape as has been used since 1992, please remember that beyond the last session with the practical guidelines for the application of the Declaration on World Heritage, there were 3 types of cultural landscapes, and one of those types was the evolutive landscape, and there were another 2 subtypes. The 2 subtypes were designed spaces, gardens and parks chiefly, and then organic evolutionary landscapes, and then associative landscapes. There's no specific reference to their location there, whether it should be found in the urban or rural environments. But when we, for instance, think of the landscape of light, this clearly fits between the first and the second. I mean, it's got a bit of both of those categories. But the Buen Retiro Park is undoubtedly a designed landscape, and I think the Paseo del Prado is also a designed landscape. But these are, according to the definition of the World Heritage Committee, these are cultural landscapes located in an urban environment. So that's one concept. Now, as regards the urban landscape, this is a valid concept too, which dates back to what Francesco explained. It goes back to the decade of 1960, the works of Gordon Callan, etc. But in parallel, we also have the concept of historic urban landscape. And once again, according to the decisions of the World Heritage Committee, it's not the same as cultural landscape. Historic urban landscape is actually an approach or a methodology to try and approach or manage urban areas with their built or natural environments. So because of what I'm putting forward, this is the way I see it. I'm not sure I'm being sufficiently clear enough. I think cultural urban landscapes can give rise to some confusion as regards the application of the World Convention. If there is a cultural landscape as such, that is the city. The city, because it's the maximum artificialization of the environment that has been created by human beings. Well, I say this precisely if this is to be applied in the case of future nominations for the World Heritage List, so that we don't spark any confusion regarding what it is that we're talking about here. And I apologize. I'm not sure whether I shed light or created further confusion. But, in particular, my proposal, if we are to talk about the definitions and typologies of cultural landscapes according to the practical guidelines, I would say cultural landscapes in urban environments or urban landscapes. Thank you.
Ay, perdón. So that was, esta es la propuesta de...
So this is Alfredo's proposal to replace urban with in urban environments, to stick to UNESCO's terminology. But Patricia also wanted to take the floor, is that right?
One thing, it's not September anymore.
It's October.
Okay.
But we only had the thought that we would say in an urban context, because we've also talked about the territory, the broader territory. So contextualizing gives us a little bit more freedom. Cultural landscapes in an urban context, 6 October.
Yeah, I'm trying to...
Porque realmente se ha...
Gracias, Álvaro. So, lanzo para evitar esta...
So, to try and avoid terminological discussions, and this is relevant not just because of the definition of terms, but also because of the scope and the objective of this document, and therefore this is going to define the objective and the scope. So I would like to propose something a bit more poetic so that we can avoid this thing. So we could say a Madrid Declaration on landscape and cities. This way, it would become the Madrid Declaration on landscape and cities, which is a bit more general. We wouldn't be applying the UNESCO terminology of cultural landscapes, and it would be less specific, but it would also lose strength, as Alfredo mentioned, in case we wanted to draw from it in the future. So that's the suggestion I'd like to make.
To tell that we have so many difficulties to put culture on the policies that perhaps we should not take this word from the title, because it's important.
Good point. Sí.
Y paisajes culturales. How about cultural landscapes and the city? Seems like everyone is saying no.
Paloma, creo que querías...
I believe you wanted to participate, Paloma. I support what you just said with regards to landscapes in the city, because I believe that one of the conclusions that we've reached is that we have to create a new terminology, and we have to talk about the same things and use the same terms and the same language. And if we've spoken about people, most of you here are experts for UNESCO, you know about that terminology, but if we want to disseminate this and we want to reach a broader audience, we have to be more clear and use a language that lay people will understand. So if we start adding last names or surnames such as cultural, whatever, no one knows what we're talking about. So if we talk about landscapes in the city, or I think that's understandable by everyone.
Voy a escribir las dos.
So I'm going to write down the two possibilities.
¿Alguien más quiere hablar?
Will anyone else like to take the floor? Alberto wishes to take the floor, and please remember to speak slowly. I just wanted to say that maybe it could be urban landscapes as cultural landscapes. We're preserving all the urban landscapes. They are all cultural because of their nature, but we can say that no, that's not it. There are some cultural landscapes that are not included within the list. If you don't mind me taking the floor, we need to advance a great deal, so I ask you to be brief, extremely brief. It's just a minor nuisance. I don't know if it's preferable to get cultural landscapes, eliminating the urban part, unless you purposely want to highlight the nature of it being urban. If you want to add urban is a concept that it is also pretty broad. Let me give you some example, especially for the people in Spain. For Palacio de Boadilla del Rey, is it in an urban environment? Is it in a rural one? Where is it? Cities are very scarce and places, and it will generate a problem as to define what a city is and what is not a city, in a concept in which city is a concept that it is being enhanced now and extended now. So my question is, let's talk only about cultural landscapes, and if we want to add an attribute to it, maybe we can say urban, because if we start debating what do we mean by urban, maybe, or city, we might have many things on the table, because the city goes beyond the continuum of what's being built today. There's a series of interstitial aspects where we mix the rural and the urban environment that are also part of the city. And that was all that I had to say. It was just a proposal and a comment, but of course respecting all the things that are being said here. Will anyone else like to take the floor? I think at the end of the day, these can make things very complicated. We're talking about the sex of angels. But let me give you an example, which is pretty anecdotal. This is a very old joke, and as a gentleman said that he always misspoke movie, and whenever they started, he learned to say it, they changed the name. So we have to try to adjust ourselves to a terminology that it is as basic as possible so that everyone will understand.
Creo que al final esto va orientado fundamentalmente.
This is mainly oriented towards citizen participation, and I imagine regular citizens listening to us, discussing about these aspects, and they will say that we're everything but clever. So let's make things as simple as possible, and if we have to say that these are cultural urban landscapes, we'll leave it as it is, and in the conclusions we can explain the reasons or the rationale behind this title.
I think we need to keep as close to the title of the conference as we can, so that the proposal would be Los paisajes culturales y la ciudad, because we talked about the context of the city, in the city, but also between landscapes outside of the city and the city. So, and it's exactly taken from the title of our conference. Thank you.
I only wanted
Bueno.
to...
A ver, perdón, si hay alguien más, es que no veo bien.
We can hardly see.
My name is Jörg Haspel, and I only would like to confirm that the idea to call it urban cultural landscapes and cities is not only intelligent, it's also very elegant to solve the problems and to bring it together on different layers. And that is what should be open, to keep it open for further discussion. We will not have a final conclusion, but we want to start to initiate a discussion process, including the cities and also the city inhabitants.
Muchas gracias, George. Bueno, pues yo creo que teniendo...
Thank you so much, George. Well, María Noel.
Follow on what Bechtel just said, and also Alfredo. with paysage culturel and the city, because we know there's this people who are actually working on nominations today within an urban context or quote-unquote urban cultural landscape, blah, 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 will rush on this and see what is said, considering Annex 3 has been deleted from the operation guidelines. Any reference, any document which addresses this issue will be picked up. And it is definitely something we've been going around in circles, because we keep saying Hull is not a type, but there are types, subtypes of urban cultural landscape. Blah. So this is sort of precise and broad. So that seems
okay. Thank
with
you.
this double aspect, institutional, what a declaration is for whom, etc., etc.
Bien, pues creo que va.
Sí,
Magellan.
sí.
I thought that the initial title was not bad. I thought that it was good because the presentations were focusing on this topic, on this reflection, but that's how we did the presentations. Otherwise, the presentations would have a different approach. Topics are very broad and they could be considered in a different way, and we could include other topics, but I think the title is what has given us the basis for the presentations. Well, in order to keep on advancing, we have here the possibilities, and I will choose one for the final version and I will distribute it afterwards, but I think we have to continue on advancing. As to the continuity, well, there's an introduction, say that us meeting in Madrid in order to debate about landscape, city will have a very broad title, and the considerations of such landscape as cultural heritage, as well as the preservation and the management. This is the typical preamble, saying taking into consideration all the documents done before. Maybe this is a bit more complicated, but for those who are not experts, but I asked the experts if they can take a look at them and so that they can tell us if there is any missing document that we need to add. And now we consider that. This is a bit redundant, but we say that cities and historic centers need to be approached from the perspective of historical landscape, and that's the conclusion that we've reached after these days. If there are any objections, although we want to go rather fast, please raise your hand and we can talk it. We also say cultural landscapes within the city are a significant element of specific characteristics to enriching the life of its inhabitants for its environmental, cultural, social, and economic features, contributing to the good lifestyle and the well-being of the citizens. Will anyone like to add something? Monica, I go back to the main point because I think that we cannot start with this point directly. We're jumping into urban historic landscape. Is more adding one or two bullet points about what we consider cultural landscape in an urban context. Maybe we can have that reflection there and talk about the methodology that has to do with historical urban landscape. I don't know if you would like to add anything else. Sorry, the person speaking is not using the mic.
Sí.
Y luego
So, es un poco de cambio de orden.
gestión y de las herramientas a utilizar para la gestión después.
Maybe changing the order and then talking about the tools. Apologies because I'm not accustomed to this computer. I'm not very good. I'm still seeing recipes.
Miren, lo pondré solo, lo voy a poner a mano.
O control X para cortar.
Y si
o
no
lo
pone un
subes arriba.
número, poner uno ya.
Control X in order to cut, or maybe you can add a number 1 or... Celia, would you like to come up here so maybe you can help me with the computer?
Control V.
Ahí.
I'm not accustomed to this computer, and especially I'm accustomed to do it with the mouse, and I think I lost what I wanted. It used to be there, but it's not anymore. Maybe Alvaro will need to stay here during the rest of the seminar. The proposal is to move this definition to the first point, and second point is how do we deal with this from this approach of the urban historic landscape. And Celia, you wanted to say something? Yes, I agree with changing the order. But I don't know if it's necessary to clarify that cities and historic centers come with a regulation that's their own regulation, and afterwards they can be dealt with from the approach of urban historic landscape. Maybe this is taken for granted, but it's something that we cannot miss here, because in Spain we have a specific legislation for protection, and a historic center needs to be included. I don't know if this is necessary. This clarification is necessary, maybe not. I think we understand that all the assets that we're speaking about come with their own legislation, which we're not going to be getting in detail because they're different in every country. Apologies, comments made without the microphone cannot be translated because we do not hear them. So if we are defining cultural landscapes, shouldn't we go into the next paragraph? They need to be considered cultural heritage and built heritage. Yeah, the fourth one, I will change it. The fourth bullet point, I will change it, and I will have it in the second, as the second bullet point.
Sí, pasa nada. Bueno, perdón, me estoy dando quizá cuenta que
I just noticed that there are some things that require verifying the order, because maybe in our draft our ideas are not really in order, but we're not going to have time to advance in the document if we keep on changing orders, and that's it. So my new proposal is for you to tell us the main point that we have to include in the declarations, and that plus the summary that we have will help us to draft the new document, because we're not going to have the time to go paragraph after paragraph, but there are very important conclusions that have been mentioned by the rapporteurs, and there are important or essential points that you want to include in the declaration. So maybe we can go to the end to write down there the main ideas that you want to include in the document. Patricia, you have the floor, and afterwards Marie Noel.
Entráis vosotros.
Un momento, me dejo los papeles.
I would like. Hola. Hello.
Solamente una pregunta.
Just one question in order to advance. I would like to know if the final document will be visible for any of us so we can read it. Of course, it will be disclosed and it will be available for the public. Hold on 1 second, because Patricia wanted to take the floor first.
I think it's important that we don't repeat and sound like a conference that was 10 years ago. There are some new ideas, and the new concepts should be captured here.
Okay.
I mean, I talked about planetary rights, I talked about biocultural diversity, We had a discussion about bioregions. We looked beyond nature-culture integration to indicate humanity as interdependent and nature and humanity integrated, not just, you know, we're still in our silos. There was a big drumbeat on climate.
So, main ideas, Patricia, just
Climate change.
Entonces las ideas
response, o sea, respuesta al cambio climático. What else, sorry?
I'm getting there, I'm letting him finish. He's trying to type.
Bueno, no es que solo pon respuesta al
Sí.
cambio climático, ya lo... Sí, so more, please,
Yes.
ideas?
The notion of bioregions,
La noción de bioregiones,
biocultural diversity, integrating, you know, people and nature, biocultural. Planetary rights, which is inclusive of people, but we're not the top dog here. We're in a planet that's in trouble because we take that opinion. Yeah, so planetary rights.
luego se lo voy a pasar todo a Álvaro. Va a ser el autor.
You know, I think the issue of conflicts came up quite a bit. I mean, we have a world in conflict, and we know that those conflicts are harmful. So I think we talked about conflict more than we talked about peace building, but maybe we have to include peace building.
Bien.
What?
Bueno, ¿estamos de acuerdo en que debe incluir estos puntos?
So do we all agree that we have to include these aspects? Okay, Virginia would like to take the floor now. We're also missing the Sustainable Development Goals, and this is aimed at people abroad and to the general public at large, politicians, the people who worked making decisions. I will talk about landscapes in the city because we're talking about cultural landscapes later on, but the whole declaration, all declarations and charters will need to come at the very end, because for people outside of our scope of action, it's very boring to read these, and they're going to start reading the charters, declarations, memorandums, and they're going to get bored. And I will have them at the very end. First, they need to read the more basic things, the simpler things, and what we want to convey, because otherwise they're going to go to the point of the declarations, they are going to get bored, and they're not going to continue on reading. So maybe we can say, taking into consideration all letters and backgrounds and notes, so that they have it in the first page, but then changing. Okay, Marie-Noël, you have now the floor.
I think it's a follow-up of what was being said. In terms of the structuring of the document, can you hear me now? To structure the again, in terms of literary style, this is a kind of declaration which is institutional, so we have to also accept that's a kind of format. And of course, we try to make it as comprehensive as possible for people. If we could shorten it, make it shorter, we have these major references, so either it's footnote or we refer to them, and we can go around and add, for example, Stockholm, we could add things on Stockholm, we could add things on Rio, things like that. But I would think it would be helpful to have, and it's difficult to write because it would be short, is a little paragraph which explains why do we refer to all that? What's the issues? It's look, where do we start from? Why did we have this conference? Well, the 2-3 key points we started off to debate. We started with here, and that's why we refer to all these documents, and that's what we've been discussing, and this is the way forward. Because here we have a lot of references to charters. Then we get into considerations, but that's not like the introduction, basically.
No, perdón, la introducción era efectivamente.
Yes, the introduction was very brief indeed. If you go all the way to the top, we say, ask the participants to the meeting on international or cultural landscapes. We can add something more there, but we are going to do so whenever the document is finished.
Obviously after, but it's just
ampliar introducción.
because if you have a little intro, then you can cut a lot more.
So, a ver. Ahora quiero que intervengáis vosotros con las conclusiones de vuestros de vuestros.
Now we want you to tell us the conclusions of your sessions that require to be introduced here. I don't know if it's appropriate, but I would like to add my artistic, aesthetic point of view of the museum. We have a fountain that shows an imaginary, and it's the contemporary city. I don't know if she meant fountain or source. And these are the landscapes that we're seeing in a very analytic way, in a very objective way, and these are these landscapes that pass through the point of view of the artists, creators that create a poetry around all the things that are being discussed here. And we're talking about inner landscapes that have to do with the environment, with the ecology, with anthropology, philosophy, but all done with a tremendous subjectivity and with a poetry that it is experimental, that you might like it more or less, it might sound more appropriate to you or less, but it is the point of view of the artist. I think this point can be included within the intangible values that we're going to end up mentioning. And of course, we might add these inner landscapes. Rapporteurs, we need to add to the things that you have mentioned how these sites are sites for inspiration, even relevant for the mental health of the citizens. Talking about the emotional part and how relevant it is for those who live close to these landscapes. I think this is personally fantastic. We'll see if the general opinion agrees with all of this. And since landscapes are so inspiring, we cannot end up having a 25 pages document, because that way no one is going to read it. So let's try to tackle the main points and the poetry within the issue, the topic, but with a practical perspective. María needs to wait, so her microphone is activated, otherwise we cannot hear her. Okay, now we can hear you. I would like to highlight of the session number 2 aspects. One of them has to do with cultural and natural heritage being a unit, a whole, and that's how they need to be understood. And the other one is that heritage needs to be understood as a means, as a tool, and not as an end, not as a goal per se. And this is the approach of Sustainable Development Goals for Heritage, using heritage as a tool to achieve a goal. So I would like to highlight these 2 aspects that were highlighted in our session. How about yours, Paloma? Celia, if you don't mind, we're going to add these aspects that they're mentioning, and afterwards we can debate. And apologies, because it seems like I'm not letting you take the floor, but you will have the opportunity later on. Okay, there are 2 things that I wanted to say. The interpretation, presentation, and dissemination of heritage has to be a guided activity, so we can have a balanced management and a balanced decision-making process. The presentation, interpretation, and dissemination and communication of the heritage has to be a guided activity leading to the balanced participation in the manage and in the decision-making process. That on one hand. On the other hand, and this is somewhat similar, we need to incorporate citizens and the identity in the local collective memory. That is to say, creating an identitary heritage. This will be debated. This is linked with the immaterial aspects and with other landscapes that are not physical landscapes. Another thing that was said in my session had to do with the labs. I don't know if you consider this to be interesting. Labs for reflection and a climate refuge. Using these public spaces, the equipment, the parks in the cities as resources and as refuge against climate change. We're adding these points, but they can be afterwards debated. Miguel, what points will you propose? In relation with the management, I think it's important when tackling this issue, consider that every landscape is a unique case and a singular case with the specific characteristics of every landscape, because very often we try to provide general landscapes that are not always applicable to each one of the landscapes. And this is essential, in my opinion, especially when thinking about the management of the landscapes. Also, I think it is very important to achieve a good dialogue between all the stakeholders, so each one of them know which are their responsibilities. And in this case, we're not only talking about public administrations. Every citizen have to become responsible in the management of the landscapes, respecting all the sensitivities. And I also think it is important to have a good exchange of knowledge. Apologies, I didn't realize that they were typing. It is very important to consider knowledge exchange, communicating knowledge. These help us to progress in the development, especially in methodologies, in management methodologies, which is the topic that we were dealing with. And I think that was it. That's more or less the summary, and these are the most important bullet points within our session. How about you, David? Can you tell us? Following what they say in terms of participation and management, there were two parts that were not included in the declaration, and they're very practical. To ask public officials for the resources adopted to our multidisciplinary needs, because to manage this we need to have resources, economic, professional, and training resources. Training, it's very interesting. And the other part, if we want to have a motivating document for those who are working in that management, we need to have a methodology to achieve the good participation of all the stakeholders, especially taking into consideration the active listening of the citizens, reviewing the current circumstances to channel the best way possible the actions that are going to be taking place. Actively listening to what people have to say, the different discourses, the different rationale. so we can better channel a participatory process. Because this is what we're asking for. We want to have a participatory process, but we need to do so with a methodological approach. It's not only a good idea to reach society so that they can participate, but we have to tell them this is a specific work and we have to do it following a certain methodology.
Una máquina.
Álvaro is a machine. I just wanted to add a few points. Well, it's already been raised several times, but we need to talk about multidisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity. This is nothing new, but I think we need to emphasize it. Because here, there's been a discussion between architects, geographers, geologists, and we all have a different way of approaching things and understanding things, so we need to be aware of that. So I think maybe we should reinforce cooperation, including the idea of reinforcing cooperation between the different disciplines and fostering a common understanding too. And this also takes me to the issue of languages. I don't know how to put it forth, but Patricia raised it too, and we concur. And this picks up on the issue of understanding and listening to others and trying to take on board the different perspectives on landscapes and urban contexts. And also about understanding. This is about lifelong learning. So we need to consider from this perspective that cultural landscapes and cities inspire us to continue to learn and can be harnessed so that we can further educate ourselves with regards to our relationship with the environment. This is something that is somewhat lost in urban settings because children don't really have that much of a chance to interrelate with nature. That's it. Anyone else? Any other concepts? Any other concepts that have been raised? Carmen, then Anna. I think it would be essential and also helpful to have the word commitment up there. To mention the word commitment and the word convergence or agreement. To refer to politicians, because we're all technical people here, but decisions are made by politicians ultimately. So maybe we need to foster that they open up their minds. The policies that are sometimes in place are outdated because when we do politics, I mean, it's time to do a co-responsible type of policy towards civil society too. It's not that we're the military, but this is not about a chain of command. I mean, here we need to share their responsibilities. So we need to emphasize engagement through these agreements too. Thank you. Anna, please. I did want to say something too. César, I am sorry. Right after Anna. Sorry because you're in the dark. I can't see you well. Or should I say it already? No, first Anna, and then César, and then in the back rows. I would include children with regards to education and with regards to commitment, because the children can also communicate this. This is not just in the hands of adults. We need to integrate children in policies and dissertations. I'm not sure how to formulate this, but I know what you're saying. We need to do education, awareness raising from the very early stages of life. Yes, indeed. And when we engage with community, at some point, we also need to include children. They can do drawings and participate. This is happening already, but this should be further emphasized because they are the future. I also think we need to include the elderly. You know, we're never included. We're never included. I agree. I fully concur. And now, fortunately, in the Western world, people who retire have a lot of time in their hands. Cesar, I'm sorry. Cesar, go ahead. Just to pick up on what has just been mentioned, maybe we should talk about having an intergenerational approach, including from childhood till old age, so that everybody can own this, so there can be a direct transfer of knowledge from the older to the younger. Well, but the point that I wanted to make, just a second. That's just because I drew some inspiration from the previous comments. That was it. But also, something that I'd like to also bring to the forefront is the ecosystems are, the landscapes are resilient human ecosystems. We are the species that has actually made up its ecosystem, its environment, and for me, an urban ecosystem. Well, I was saying human ecosystem, not urban ecosystem, but you can say urban/human. But that was my reflection. And also we need to put the finger on a priority, which is for these ecosystems to foster decarbonization, bringing back the wild, humanism, and self-governance. And all sovereignties, food, sovereignty, well, I don't know whether that could be introduced too. I'm not sure we'll have enough space for all that. Yes, I'm sorry, I just wanted to propose that. No, but it's quite fine. The word ecosystem had to be related to.
The points and recommendations we are listing up, I came back to the beginning and to what Patricia mentioned, that what is the reason why we meet? We meet here to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the World Heritage Convention as well as of the 30th anniversary of the cultural landscape. But I think we are impressed and we are under the experience of the last 3, 4, 5 years, which made us clear, under the experience of the pandemic situation, under the experience of the climate change, which is everywhere, can be experienced, which is very close to us, and under the experience of war and armed conflicts. And maybe in the beginning, we should start to have this. This is not to have a new list, but to make clear that we met here for the anniversary, but we are under this impression. That is why this paper is totally different from every paper we had before.
Absolutely, Georgia. I think we should include that. Creo que deberíamos.
Yes, I do think that we should include those points in the preamble, in the introduction, so that we can actually outline where our reflection is coming from, right? The starting point.
I just want to say that should we include something, this idea of using existing windows and mentioning in that there are a lot of issues out there that local communities are aware of, such as we have a national biodiversity plan in Ireland. There are issues to do with IUCN and what they are doing, and we really need to link in, because the more different issues we have, we want to be joining up with existing issues as well. And the other, particularly in relation to biodiversity and climate change, and that we all need to know ourselves about biodiversity and climate change, as is one of the #1 issues for landscape. The other issue I'd say is that this document is very interesting, but what about, we mention a lot about communities, but communities a lot of the time are looking for information or for guidelines. And how do you make this document available to communities in ways that they can understand without being too technical?
Mm-hmm. Sí,
Thank you.
And thank you, because I was,
Thank you, because I was actually missing that. Because next time we get together, we shouldn't just invite people from the cultural sphere, but rather, as was mentioned before, we need to engage with other people. We cannot be talking about the natural part without having representatives. And Lería, sorry, I skipped you. No, but can you wait? There's more people back there, right? Yes, hello, good day. I am under the impression that here we are mixing up the conclusions with the intentions. Because at the end of the day, here we should be trying to analyze what has been discussed. And you can say, we've drawn conclusions out of what has been discussed, but perhaps out of some of the things that were discussed, we didn't draw any conclusions. Maybe it's just a statement of intentions by a series of people who have their interest, and the disinterests are also revolving around landscapes and heritage. But it's difficult to include that in the form of a conclusion. Perhaps it would be advisable to say, okay, there's a series of broad and general conclusions that we can draw, and a series of opinions or recommendations or interests by different groups of a technical, scientific, and citizen level, expressing the need for there to be a series of changes, which is what we're discussing here, because we're talking about the need to change many things in the governance system, in the research system, in the system of concerns in general, concerns of people in their daily life. And at the end of the day, our daily life is our very own landscape for each and every single one of us. So if I had to read through all this, everything that's being included there, I'd probably have a stroke. I mean, I wouldn't even make it halfway through. So maybe we need to summarize the conclusions as such, and then maybe propose discussions. I mean, maybe we should explain it that way. We opened up the discussion and these issues were raised even though we didn't reach a conclusion. Antonio, I am sorry, but actually I made the mistake of not showing you the structure. First, we had the background, the different international charters, and then we said, taking into account the analysis and the conclusions, we recommend that, and that included a series of recommendations. And indeed, maybe now we need to link up some of them, the ones that refer to communities or social participation. We will have to group them up. I mean, this is a letter to Santa, right? Or the three wise men here in Spain. So this is a letter to Santa anyway. We need to come up with a document that can be read and that can be useful too. Yes, but most importantly, I'm under the impression that over the course of the discussion, there's been ideas that have come up, and perhaps they weren't originally conceived to be part of this meeting, right? So maybe new topics have emerged that have sparked the discussion, and maybe we need to separate that from the initial intention that we had when organizing this event. Yes, this is what we want to do. We want to establish the background and then the things that have been included in addition. So, Alberto? Yes, Alberto. As part of the recommendations, I would include that we have to analyze the effect. I'm going to wait for Alvaro to find the place to write. So maybe we need to analyze the effect that the condition of a cultural landscape has on the urban sphere, how it affects use, transformation, exploitation. I mean, this is closely related to citizens. Once your territory becomes a cultural landscape, tourism kicks in, preservation and conservation kick in, and I think this is also relevant for the interpretation and the future evolution of that area or that sphere. Perfect, thank you. Right here. No, but first Fernando, he hasn't taken the floor. I would really like it if we could say that we are not just anywhere. We're here in Madrid, in the landscape of light, cultural landscape. Science and art are united here, and there's a lovely statement at the end of the book. I mean, we should emphasize this, because this backdrop, being here in Madrid, and all the people who have gathered here have served as inspiration for this to happen. So maybe that should be the starting point. We're not in China, we're not in South America, we are in Madrid. So maybe we should pay tribute to that and to the different very specific presentations that we've done. And we've heard neighbors speak. We're not talking about people who live in Brasilia or in Buenos Aires. We've heard people from the community speak. And they're not just from anywhere, they're here from Madrid. Thank you very much, Fernando. Thank you, because this actually sets the cultural scope, right? It would be very different if we were elsewhere. And it's also very important that the landscape of light has served as inspiration for a discussion about landscapes. Anyone else? Right here. I am sorry, Antonio. Just a very brief remark. As part of everything that has been discussed here, we've talked a lot about biodiversity and environmental values, but there is a concept that maybe hasn't really been prominent and could be included, which is the proposal to do agricultural use of this, because we talked about the importance of gardens and landscapes, but the agricultural use in the case of Vega de Aranjuez, Murcia, and many other areas that are part of our geographical territory. That is a very important component, and it's a way to respect the environment, environmental values, and it's also a way to maintain biodiversity. So it's a very straightforward. When we talk about gardens and when we talk about parks, we talk about environmental aspects, and maybe we could talk about the agricultural uses of the past that are still existent today. And in some cases, we've tried to retrieve them with the farmlands of La Partida in the case of Madrid Rio. So it's a very specific proposal. So, and now I'd like to share a comment or a question, and I'm not providing an answer or a solution for it. We talked about the fact that heritage should be used as a means and not an end. Using it as a tool, it's not really difficult, but rather risky, because landscapes are identitarian as such. They are not a tool to who knows what end, right? So that's just a thought that I'd like to share. Thank you, Antonio. Alberto, no, I cannot really see you.
Carrie, good.
This is actually getting back to, I think, the basics, the preamble. If you could write this down, please. landscapes are the city, city are people, people are the landscape. And in each of those, landscape, perhaps a qualifier, nature, culture, cities, perhaps the qualifier, greater urban context, and people, transgenerational.
Kerry, you said it beautifully, but we missed something with the translation. Okay. So, and I don't think you'll be able to do it as either. We look at, this is being recorded, no?
Yes.
So either we take it from the recording, or perhaps you can send it to me.
Sure.
Written.
But just the idea that,
yeah,
kind of where Patricia was going of, do we want to rehash things that have already been said in many other conferences? What does this conference offer that's different? And I think the premise is that we come at it very differently. That Hull is integrated into city planning, management, everything. And so we have this very simple statement: landscapes are city, city are people, people are landscape.
Okay, thank you so much. In any case, please, written. You send this small paragraph. Perdón, sí, sí. Pues os doy paso.
Yes, I can give you the floor while this is being written. I'd like to mention something that was raised during my panel, and I'd like to clarify it. It has just been mentioned. The concept of heritage being a means and not really an end, per se. Now, this statement is part of the SDGs of the UN. It's not an approach that we have come up with at this discussion. This is stated by the UN. Heritage must be understood as a means and not an end per se, as a tool to foster economic, social, and environmental development. And we must think about this new approach to heritage to manage our urban landscapes, landscapes in the city, cultural landscapes and the city, or in the city, or however you want to put it. It's not our approach that has come up spontaneously here. It's something that is part of SDGs, and it's important to clarify this. It's not something that we have come up with here today. It's something that was conceived before, and it's in the contents of the SDGs. Okay, Lería, now over to you. And then we'll give you a minute, but I'll give the floor to Lería because I interrupted her an hour and a half ago. Well, what I mean to say also has to do with this statement. It has to do with the tool. I think it's a big mistake because heritage should be an object of protection as such, not because it can contribute towards development, but rather because heritage deserves to be protected. So it is an end itself, and then it can also contribute. It can also be a tool. When SDGs approach heritage, they haven't done it in a comprehensive or conscious way, I think. And many other organizations have also submitted recommendations because we think that the instrumentalization of heritage, not as an end per se, not as a set of assets which are valuable per se, but valuable towards another different purpose, it's dangerous, and it also leads to things that are not desirable. So maybe we can say that heritage is to be protected, and it can also serve other purposes. And in addition, something that I wanted to mention is that maybe we need to talk about public visits to heritage. Public visits that should be planned in a responsible manner, observing the fragility of those assets and the capacity to host those visitors too. That's all. We have 4 minutes left. I've come to the sessions as a citizen and as a neighbor that lives near the City of Light. And I'd love to leave this meeting with something to tell my fellow neighbors, so that I can share some type of hope as to the fact that this is going to be cared for, that this landscape is going to be cared for, because cultural landscapes are not idle, are not just there. We need to make them lasting. We need to help them last over time. And this is why I would love to leave this meeting with a message to share. We talked about education here, but those that are responsible for this at the city and community levels, are they really going to get to work and come up with educational materials so that children and the whole educational community, including parents, can draw from this? It would be a way to reach society as a whole from an educational angle, including children, parents, and teachers. Is this something that people in charge of education are going to take on board? At the city level, the regional level, or will this be to no avail, and will it just be something that is put on a piece of paper? As a neighbor of the City of Light, I'd like to know, what is it that I can do? What is it that I can tell my fellow neighbors, my colleagues, neighbors associations? I mean, is there any hope that the city's authorities, that the City Council will actually echo everything that has been said here? Will they note this, or will it just be on paper? Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for participating as a neighbor of this asset. And I hope that, yes, that this will serve a purpose. I think initially it has opened new avenues. I cannot assure you what the administration is going to do or not do. I know that the regional government is making an effort to educate people about heritage and about landscape, and I know that the City Council has some programs on this. I think. I cannot really guarantee it because I'm not in the City Council. But Carmen, there are some programs, right? I think there are some programs. And Luis is here too. And I do think that we mustn't just sit back and wait for administrations to do something. We need to participate. If we are all the landscape, we need to get to work too. It's not about asking what others are going to be doing, but also we need to set ourselves in motion, like you did, to come here and to be able to disseminate what has been mentioned here. I think will be useful and interesting for the neighbors, and this is one of the reasons that we had for this meeting. Thank you very much for your questions. Actually, anyone else? Patricia?
Thanks. I wanted to reiterate that there's a reciprocity, that the landscapes benefit from our care, our protection, our management, and our respect, and that people get multiple benefits from the landscape. So to me, it's a little way, a lens of organizing some of the things that have been said, because what we tend to focus on is how landscape benefits us. But we don't create the reciprocity in the document of what our responsibilities are on behalf of landscape. And I would suggest that we look very carefully at the words serve, use, own, because those all imply a one-way street. We are not on a one-way street. We are on a two-way street. So let's look very carefully in this declaration for all about people. It's not all about people. If it isn't about planet, we're not here. Maybe some insects, maybe some plants will survive, but we need to turn ourselves around. It has to be a paradigm shift of huge levels for us to actually move forward in a planet that's healthy.
Yeah. Thank you. Marinoel y Alberta, y si no veo a nadie más.
Marinoel and Alberta, and if anyone else wants to take the floor.
If I was to sum up some of the key points in 2 seconds to someone I met on the street, I would say we've been looking again at the role and function of heritage, and we should actually stress that, because that's how that opens to heritage as a solution, and that's definitely a trend in the past years. Comes from Hull also, but role and function of heritage, intrinsic values, how they are used and can be a solution. So that's a discourse that goes with what Patricia has said, which is not weakening conservation, but we've been talking a lot about a type of heritage, urban cultural landscape as a type, and we have the whole discussion, the geographer's discussion on the approach and understanding of heritage. So we've got several layers of concepts and ideas which we need to clarify in the structure of the text, in the introduction, and actually say, we acknowledge there's a confusion, and this confusion has been going on for a long time, and we're actually addressing it, not be shy of the urban cultural landscape thing. So that I think should be clear. In terms of wording, clearly say that the draft is in Spanish, because the language will have an impact on the concepts. And in the English translation, I would make sure we have the word territory in English, and make sure we have not only communities, but also people, because there are lots of terms which are very Anglo and become mainstream because it's international documents. So for wording, I think we need to address this directly also in the intro, preamble, whatever. Thank you.
Thank you, Marinel. Yeah, languages is always a problem, but this will be first written, perdón. Esto será escrito primero en español.
This will be written first in Spanish, it is true, and afterwards translated into English, but we will jointly review the terms used. I think we also need a different tourist policy with the development of alternative itineraries in order to avoid to limit the enjoyment of only the more attractive values, and we have to communicate the value of some places that are considered to be minor. And this is very important for a question of cultural identity for the citizens of the city being visited, and also for the tourist. Rapporteurs, are we missing anything that you consider to be extremely relevant? Of course, if afterwards, when reviewing your notes, you see that you've missed something, of course, we can add whatever is necessary. Just an issue with regards to heritage education. I totally agree that heritage needs to be preserved, and it is an object of preservation, but it is not a tool, but a set of tools. Anyone working with a working tool, we all have a tool and we think about it, but I think there's nothing better than having a toolbox, a tool set that works for what you're aiming it for. Of course, if you don't have the tool, there's nothing that you can do. This working in layers is something that we're working on in heritage education. Heritage education has to do in educating towards heritage, with the heritage, for the heritage, depending on the work that you want to do. And in all of these, we're including people in order to guarantee the preservation. This is a tool for many things. Of course, I'm very clear about that. Okay, to wrap up, because at one point, unfortunately, we have to put an end to this. Otherwise, we could spend days talking about the topic, and thanking Alvaro for his speed typewriting. I think you've left in our hands a very hard work to do, because we already have 10 pages drafted, and we'll have to do a tremendous work in summarizing everything. Some of the very specific and precise issues will not be there, but we'll try to get the spirit of all of the points, and we'll circulate it before or as soon as possible. First, we'll have the Spanish version, and probably we'll first distribute Google translation, and afterwards we'll have the review of a native speaker, and we can have this conceptual and terminological review. So with this, Alvaro, we thank you for your help. Imagine this could have been a total nightmare with me dealing with a computer. And yeah, a big round of applause for Alvaro. He's been very helpful. And to finish, before the closing event, I would like to call Carmen to join me on the scenario. I would like to thank also our rapporteurs for their wonderful work, and the one that will continue on doing. You were essential today. Thanks to your conclusion, we've seen how all of these scattered ideas have taken a shape, and they have been put together. So thank you very much.
Muchísimas.
Thank you so much. Maybe this is because you found this meeting interesting, so I think we can say that we did a more or less good job. And Carmen and I would like to say some final practical words, although the official closing of the event will take place a bit later. Thank you, thank you, thank you very much. Our small landscape here in this bouquet. This was a total surprise, very pleasant, and this helps us to face something similar soon. I think it is important for us to open this opportunity to the national meetings and international as well. Why not? I just want to say that I'm very thankful. I'm very thankful to ICOMOS, to the participants, to our dear colleagues in the central administration and in the regional government of Madrid for giving us a hand. And I think that for the landscape of light, this Congress was essential because it has helped us to understand. We've learned from this sharing experiences activity that we've had, so we can implement new ways of managing our assets, and it's opened our minds, the minds of the experts, so we can learn and we can share the responsibility of managing things. And I think this is the best and the most positive of all the things that I've taken from this Congress. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this small landscape that I'm taking home with me. And I wanted to thanking Luis Lafuente, who is the director of the department that has made this Congress possible, but also to those who are behind the stage helping us. And we just have to take a look at the document to see how indispensable they are. I wanted to thank Pedro Ortega, Enrique Sanz, Paloma Ramos, Carmen. I don't need to thank her because she's here with me and we have both suffered together, but also thanks to Álvaro, our super typewriter. To his whole team, all the technicians helping us with the sound and everything. The interpreters, because sometimes they've done a wonderful job. Thank you very much. Next time, Alberto, you have to buy some flowers for the interpreters. But above all, I want to thank all and each one of you for your participation, to the speakers, because you came despite all the difficulties, the organizational difficulties that we had. I'm getting so excited. You've responded to our call. We've been friends for a long time. We've shared some bad nights, and sometimes we've had some difficulties as the organizers, but still you bear with us. You had the fantastic opportunity of coming here to share your experience, your knowledge, but above all your friendship, and those who came from Madrid, from abroad, all the ones who have been following this through the streaming service. Some people who really wanted to come but they couldn't make it because of several difficulties and personal problems. We're sincerely thankful for following this online, and this makes us feel very encouraged to organize more meetings. This is going to be the first one of many to come in the future. All of us discussing around the wonderful idea of our landscapes. Thank you very much to everyone.
Y ahora, como no podía faltar.
And now, we have to think about the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the convention. That's the reason that partly brought us here. And even though, well, I even thought that I could bring a cake, but then I thought, what am I going to be doing with the cake? With the 50 candles around the city council. And also Alvaro could kill me if he had to deal with a cake, but we want to blow the candles and we want to sing happy birthday to you to the convention. We know that there's plenty of criticism around it, but it's still a wonderful tool for cooperation, and for that we have today María Agúndez from the Ministry of Culture. María, are you here? I couldn't see you. I thought she had run away, but she is the one who, on behalf of the Ministry of Culture, will close the seminar. So we'll be celebrating with them this 50th anniversary of the convention. And then we'll say not so much goodbye, but see you later.
Muchas gracias, Mónica.
Thank you very much, Monica, for inviting the Ministry of Culture to participate in this closing ceremony. As Monica was saying, I represent the General Direction of Fine Arts. They are the ones in charge of the coordination of this convention in Spain. And when we said, yes, we were going to participate, we were really happy. But yesterday I thought there's hardly anything that I can say about the convention on the World Heritage, because you're experts, you're the real experts, you know more than we do. What could I tell them about the Convention on World Heritage? Luis Lafuente, Mandarin, who is working for the City Council, but it's my job to do so. Hopefully you will not be bored. The idea is to review what has happened with the convention ever since it came into force until nowadays, and how we've had some events and actions around the 50th anniversary of the convention, organized by UNESCO, World Heritage Center, and the ones that we've done at the ministry and in general. As Monica was saying, the convention, with positive and negative things, is been up and running for 50 years, and it is the flagship of UNESCO. It is the best known convention. The one for immaterial assets is very similar to the one of the World Heritage. It was also very successful, and we have to say that it comes with two very important elements: uniting cultural and natural heritage and putting them at the same level, although we will see later that the representation in the list is not exactly balanced. What matters is that although it was created in 1972, it uses the cultural concept in a very broad way. Although in the title they're talking a very, very specific type of heritage, the world cultural at that time came with a very broad sense. and it was very innovative at that time in 1972. The second important point within the convention is how we're putting together the cultural and the natural part, and the idea of all the countries and all the states have to get together in the idea of approaching heritage. Convention talks about preservation, safeguarding is the term that we're using right now. Protection is limited to the preservation of the site, where a safeguard has to do with preserving, protecting, but also disseminating knowledge about this. These are some of the aspects that were mentioned today. Letting people know about it and raising awareness is very important for all citizens and for all administrations to be fully aware, irrespective of the sector that they're covering, whether if we're talking about environmental transition, economy, or whatever. They need to be aware about our heritage. And the second point within the convention is the idea of World Heritage being something that goes beyond our border. It is not only for the countries, the ones that have the obligation of preserving their heritage, but all of the countries, all of the citizens of the world should be in charge of preserving this. This is the picture of Palmyra. When they suffered this attack, this was impacting not only Syria, but everywhere country, any country that is aware of the relevance of heritage. Convention was approved in 1972, but it came into force in 1975 once 20 member states ratified the convention. This is what happens with all conventions. At the same moment in which the convention was approved and ratified, we created a list of World Heritage in danger. The definition of it was not really correct at that time, but it was necessary. It was World Heritage, but for whatever reasons you are in a list in which you are going to receive the help that you need so you can better preserve your heritage. You might be in that list because of war reasons, or because of environmental reasons or circumstances that had happened all of a sudden, or because for different reasons you are not capable of preserving this heritage correctly. And at the same time, they created the Fund for World Heritage, because it's very important to have enough finances for it. There are several reasons why this fund is insufficient nowadays, and in fact they're working to solve the problem of the lack of funds. Spain ratified the convention in 1982, and in 1978 were established the practical guidelines, where they say how to put in practice and how to implement the convention. Amongst other principles, one of the most important one is to make compulsory the monitoring and the presentation of the reports for World Heritage assets. This is very important because the objective is not only to have this World Heritage Declaration. Countries seems to be very interested in having this World Heritage Declaration, but once declared, we need to preserve these exceptional or outstanding universal values, and we need to preserve the sites. In 1978, we have the first asset, Galapagos Islands, as natural and heritage, and some mines in Poland. Ever since 1978 until 2022, we've seen different kinds of heritage declared in Chile, and natural ones, which are the least represented ones. This is a system, as you all know, of lists. It's a system of lists that work really well. And what it is outstanding within this convention system, we see that all the ones that are well known have used this system of list. We're working with the immaterial one whenever it was drafted later on in 2003, being fully aware of the problems associated to this list system. Most of the countries requested this list system, and thanks to this list system, the immaterial convention is so well known. And the level of ratification is almost as high as the one of the Convention of World Heritage. We also have the Underwater Convention that from the legal standpoint is the most complicated one, and therefore the least ratified by the member states, only has 80 ratifications up to date, and is created a system of list of best practice in the protection, safeguard, and protection of the underwater heritage. This list gives a lot of visibility. This means that this is communicated to the people, and once communicated, people demands the protection of them, and this is very important, irrespective of our need of improving the system of list. Being on the list obliges those responsible to preserve the heritage, and it gives it visibility. As we were saying before, the operational guidelines included a monitoring system for these assets. Right now we're talking about 4 systems. Periodic reports that we need to present next year are in Europe, Spain amongst other European countries. We've already gotten in contact with a few of you. Then the reactive system, because sometimes for different reasons there are some reports and we have a reactive monitoring business and a reactive system. In Spain, we're not doing really bad. We are not receiving that many monitoring business. We don't have any site in the endangered list, although this is taking us a great effort. And in general, we are not one of the countries with more reports. And if we are reported, we can achieve a level of understanding. We are very good at answering, although we've seen ourselves in critical situations, for example, Seville or the National Park of Doñana, that it is always on the verge of being included in the endangered list. But this is due to climate change. Avila also has faced some problems. There are always stressful moments, as you've been discussing these last days, especially with cultural landscapes, which are the most complicated to preserve, and the historic urban landscape, World Heritage cities, etc. Then we have the next system, which is the list of endangered world heritage, and finally taking something out of the list. That hardly ever happens. We've only seen 3 cases, one for a natural asset that was requested by the site itself and the country itself. Then the other one that was mentioned by Minsitry yesterday in his presentation, and there was even like a public consultation to see what to do, if a breach or non-breach, and at the end it was the breach, and therefore it was taken out of the list. That was the island of Dresden. And finally Liverpool, that was taken out of the list. The harbor had been declared World Heritage, but they did a tremendous town planning development with a new football stadium, and after many years of the city being, or the harbor being at the endangered list, it was taken out of the list. And we have a General Assembly of all the member states, 190, all the countries with voting rights. Then we have the Committee of World Heritage with 21 states in the 6 areas of UNESCO. The committee has a lot of strength. They make decisions. They meet once a year, and not only do they make the decision of including things on the list, including sites of the endangered list, but also they make decisions with regards to amendments in the operating guidelines. Then we have the Center for World Heritage, the Secretariat. They are very busy. They have less and less human resources and more work. And then we have the consultative bodies such as ICOMOS, UICN, and ICROM. And this is the paradox of the convention. On one hand, we have the member states. They are the ones who present their candidacies. They are the ones in charge of verifying the preservation states, but then they make decisions. So there is a political aspect that we can not forget. And then we also have the paradox of always working with NGOs. Sometimes member states and NGOs do not have a good understanding. This has been broadly debated with the national and international ICOMOS and the Secretariat, with the Center of World Heritage at the committee. But after many discussions, this is the system that works better, at least up until now, and that's the one we're going to maintain for the moment. As I said before, we have a yearly meeting and we make sure that the convention is applied, and the Secretariat, the Center for World Heritage, they do dissemination activities, they receive the candidacies, the consultations, they send them to ICOMOS, they do the technical monitoring of the preservation status, they do a lot of seminars and some dissemination work, less and less every day. As I said before, we had less human resources. And as to the requirements to be part of this list, we need to have this outstanding universal value, integrity and authenticity, and of course presenting a good protection, preservation and management. In our case, the maximum level of legal protection as allowed by the regulation, deciding on the limits of the site with the buffer zone. This was one of the most important aspects in Madrid, whether if we were going to have this buffer zone. And finally, the management plans, which is the mandate now. It wasn't the mandate on the first candidacies, but this is a topic that we're working on for the 49 sites that we have in Spain. We are insisting on having the appropriate management plan, and the candidacies that we are presenting today need to come with a management plan. In fact, it was one of the strong points in Madrid, and it came with great complicity and taking into consideration all of the stakeholders. That was very complicated in Madrid. And then to have a sustainable use. The process is very long. You spend at least 1 year in the tentative list, then you have to prepare a file, then there is a panel between ICOMOS, UICM, the member state, always requesting information, and finally the declaration by the World Heritage Committee. This is going to become even more complicated from now on. They have established an intermediate process in which you have to not only be in the tentative list, but then you have to have an intermediate project in between, like an interim report, so you know if you have the possibility of being declared World Heritage or not. This new system was broadly requested by all member states and above all by ICOMOS and IUCM, sorry, but they thought that it was very important. For example, if you don't have an outstanding universal value, you cannot reapplied, so the process is being extended. It's going to be a minimum of 5 to 6 years. What are the advantages of being included in the list of World Heritage? You know it very well because you all have sites, but this is an honorary recognition. You're made visible in a map. You have this guarantee of UNESCO level, which is the maximum that you can aim for, graded dissemination, and it encourages tourism. We not always. Almaden, after the declaration, saw a reduction in the number of tourists, but in general terms, it encourages tourism and cultural tourism, which is understood to be a higher level or better quality type of tourism. But we also assume some obligations. Public officials associated to World Heritage sites forget about these obligations. We have to maintain the universal outstanding value no matter what, the integrity and the authenticity. So you have to have a good level of protection and management in terms of regulations, the borders or limitations of the sites, respecting the buffer zone, informing if we're going to do some works in the site. It is true that according to the text of the operating guidelines, you need to inform if you're going to do some works on the site, especially if they can impact the outstanding universal value, and that's hard for all of us. This reporting task is very complicated, and also we have to do the evaluation of cultural impact. This is a topic of which UNESCO has made many publications lately. We want these cultural impact assessments to be regulated under the regulation, although we still haven't done it, but this is a norm, and it is important to do these cultural assessment evaluations, so we see if the works that we are foreseen to do, because obviously cities and World Heritage sites need to continue on advancing in their development, but if you do this evaluation, you will be able to see if this work can have an impact in the outstanding universal value, and it is going to be very impactful. Maybe you can change the works that you want to do. We're applying this more and more in Spain, and we have very positive examples in Ávila, in Cuenca. Madrid has also done so, and little by little we're working on that, all of us together, central administration, regional and local administration, but in other cases we forget about this.
This is something that I already mentioned before. It's the forced monitoring mechanisms that we have in place, just for you to get a flavor as to what the situation of World Heritage is. Here you can see cultural heritage in yellow, and the red ones are those that are endangered. Natural heritage is in green, and we see that there's a lack of balance. Europe is over-dimensioned. Africa is not even barely represented, and in Asia we have some, so in Latin America. But just for you to know the numbers, there's 1,154 assets included in this list. Here we wanted to also highlight the idea of international cooperation. This is one of the strong points here. In terms of World Heritage, international candidacies are not well represented. It's 43 for intangible. There's been a greater international increase in international candidacies. In Spain, we have a few, actually 3, if my recollections are right. Almaden, Conadrilla, Spain and Portugal have art candidacy, and Spain has another one with France, a cultural and natural candidacy for Monte Perdido. There's 52 assets that are endangered, and the complexity is indeed visible in the map. Europe is over-dimensioned, but there's 197 cultural assets, 218 natural, and 39 are mixed. Even though the convention was ratified by 190 countries, only 167 have World Heritage sites. One of the countries that doesn't have any is Bhutan. It has a great heritage, but they never presented themselves for a nomination. Ever since this came in force in the year 78, there's been progress made, and there's been several investments. In the year 92, the concept of cultural landscapes was introduced. This has oftentimes been mentioned over the course of these days, and also the World Heritage Center was created. It's important to highlight, since the 78 until 1992, we have had 377 sites registered. So in the beginning, there was an exponential growth of the convention and the registration of sites. Moving along the same lines, and following the reflection, the year 94, there was a global strategy for a balanced, representative, and credible World Heritage list. In the year 94, this was proposed, and there were several publications, like, for instance, a fill in the gaps document to determine which sites or categories were underrepresented. But here we are in 2022, and we still see a great gap. The idea of a credible, representative, and balanced World Heritage list hasn't been materialized. Here, state parties should really reflect as to why we haven't succeeded. In the year 94, there was the ENARA document talking about authenticity and recognizing the specific nature of heritage values, so we could have a more global perspective. We continue to do research and to consider how to expand the convention under a more modern backdrop. So in the 30th anniversary of the convention in Budapest, there was a 3C convention that was approved. We continue to emphasize credibility. Also, we emphasize the importance of conservation, but here we also started to talk about the importance of education with capacity building and communication. Dissemination is important. It's been raised over the course of the session that we really need to highlight the value of everything that we do in this area. Apart from this, for us, which are of a more technical nature, citizens need to be aware of what they have around them and what heritage means. Now, in the year 2017, we included a 5th C, which is community.
Material, entonces aquí ya.
In 2007 this was, and here we started to know the importance of community, the importance of creating the concept of heritage. Administrations cannot conserve themselves the heritage. The heritage needs to be something alive that citizens engage with. If you go to the Burgos Cathedral, you'll think maybe the priests or the administration should look after this. But if it's a party, a town party, then or a town celebration, then it's something that you can care for too. So, from the natural perspective, with the strength that the environment, recycling has gained, I think citizens are more prone to care for their natural environment because they think that cultural heritage is something a bit further from them. We made progress talking about cultural landscapes and historic cities. We talked about the need to develop them. So the Vienna Memorandum was created, thus developing the concept of historical urban landscape, which is something that we still try to find consensus on. And in 2014, we had a number 1,000 registered. We thought that we would peak by then, but now we continue to have nominations. And finally, the last turning point was in 2018 with the Warsaw recommendation. And this really involved the citizens. The city underwent a very much process, and the citizens got engaged to rebuild it. So there was a recommendation as to how to implement those recommendations and how to engage with citizens. And this is why in 2018 we talked about the Warsaw recommendation, which was discussed in the committee that meeting that took place in Manama in Bahrain. And then finally there was another online meeting last year, and Madrid was declared World Heritage. Then two committees met in 2020 because of the pandemic. We couldn't meet, and in 2021 it happened online. And there were new topics to be researched, to be studied: the impact of the pandemic on World Heritage, identity document on World Heritage and climate change, and a new line of work which is very interesting, which is sites linked to conflict areas. Since 2018, in the committee that took place then, there was a series of candidacies that had been assessed by ICOMOS, and ICOMOS said that it was that didn't have the capacities to evaluate them because this was linked to memory sites, and they came up with the idea of coming up with a working party, analyzing those candidacies and then assessing them. And this takes us to 2022, thus celebrating the 50th anniversary of the convention. There were very many projects in the pipeline, holding once again a face-to-face committee meeting. It hasn't been able to happen, but we are celebrating the 50-year anniversary, thinking about the features that will come in the next 50 years. All countries are invited to engage in several activities related to the 50th anniversary, working on climate change, sustainable tourism, the participation of society, World Heritage and education. We've seen how these topics are a few of the most important ones: education and awareness across all the different spheres, of course, not just at schools. Also, Africa continues to be a priority. It's the continent that has the fewest World Heritage sites, and once again we hear the same tune: the sustainability of the list. As part of the World Heritage Center, they also established 3 points, or 3 very important activities. First, a high-level event in Greece, in Delphos, specializing on archaeology and World Heritage. Also, they wanted to organize an event or some sessions to reflect in Florence on the pipelines work that I mentioned before. And also, we wanted to organize another event in Africa so that we can give more credibility to the list and have more sites declared In Africa, there's also been a series of activities, the 50-50 approach, so that we could have 50 intellectuals talk about this topic for the next, and the approach for the next 50 years, talking about resilience and the different fields that we have touched upon: digital transformation, balance, climate change. And one of the other things that have happened in UNESCO as a whole is a change of logo. It hasn't yet been officially approved, though. And some working parties have been created. First, sites associated to conflict memories, also the sustainability of the World Heritage Fund, and climate change. Climate change was subject to a very interesting and groundbreaking publication before, but now we're working on changing a series of points on operational guidelines, because there's countries that are very strong and that are advocating for this. Australia, for instance, its coastlines are taking a great hit from climate change, and they're truly advocating for this. And one of the very complex things from my perspective, and one great challenge for the convention, is conflict areas, the issue of conflict areas. The conclusion that has been reached, and there's been a great discussion as to whether this convention had been envisaged to cover this, or whether a different convention should be created, whether we should include conflict sites. And maybe we could have a tool so that all countries can work towards the conservation of heritage. We were wondering whether introducing this would create further tensions. There was a bit of a clash here. When you attend UNESCO meetings, you can actually see the different places of the world. Group 1, Western Europe, thinks differently than the African group or Asian countries. And there was a series of areas that were clear as to the fact that conflict sites could be included in the World Heritage Convention, that there's room for that, and that they had to work on it. But this poses a problem, because if you declare a site but there's a neighboring country that actually doesn't support it, because there's some some heritage sites where we already see this type of tensions. So we've come up with a simpler proposal. If a country wants to propose a site with these characteristics, they need to make this public, take it to the tentative list, and see whether someone challenges, some other country challenges it, or there are some amendments proposed. It's not a bad way to go about it. It's a way to further work on the International Convention, which is what the UNESCO should do, and some of the countries should also emphasize international cooperation, not thinking so much about registering sites, but rather helping other countries propose their sites too. So this might be a way for countries to work together, for countries that perhaps have some attention too, and something positive could come out of this. So let's see how this pans out. It's a complicated thing, though. Also, at UNESCO this year, they have been working on cultural impact assessments too. A new manual or handbook has been published. In the central administrations, we've tried to make this known. We had an exhibit in the book fair. We organized conferences, and we also have a website. Different sites, different World Heritage sites could upload their activities there. We also have a publication that hopefully will be available on the 16th of November, and we will organize an event to celebrate World Heritage Day. And this is the way we've come to our 50th anniversary without being able to hold a committee meeting. That's a great pity. The committee should have been organized in Russia. Of course, it was not suitable to go to Russia to have a committee meeting. There was no agreement amongst countries. And actually, when you go to the meetings to see what's going on, you realize the different tensions that are in place in the world over. We don't know whether we should delay this, maybe change the site and maintain the presidency. But if we change the place or the venue and keep Russia in the presidency, there's countries that are not going to accept that. So, unfortunately, we cannot have a nice celebration of World Heritage to celebrate the 50th anniversary. Hopefully this will change. But Before we conclude, I think this calls for a reflection amongst all who are part of this convention, the state parties, the administrations that also work on implementing this convention and that work on conservation and presenting candidacies. We should reflect as to what is it that we want to do with the convention. Do we want to continue registering sites? If there had been a committee, Spain would have registered the number 50, the 50th anniversary would have been celebrated that way. But we want to continue to register sites. We have a capacity to maintain those 50 World Heritage sites. This would be a reflection that state parties would have to do. Now we're the fourth country. We've been the first, the second, the third. We're fourth now. Is this a fight to be ranked? Or maybe we should focus on other things. For instance, Spain, that has so many sites in the list. Maybe we should support other countries so that they can put forth their candidacies. International cooperation, which is something that the convention really hasn't streamlined so far, at least from my perspective and that of the administration too. And also, from my perspective, and Monica, I'm sorry, consultative bodies should also reflect on this. It's very difficult to support others to do candidacies that are subsequently assessed, and if state parties don't like the assessment done by the assessment bodies, then this is changed at the committees. I mean, in a way, we are all causing the convention to not have a clear technical character, and maybe that's the most negative point that we see over the course of the last years in which the convention has been applied. In spite of that, we have 1,152 sites that are included and conserved under the idea that these are sites that our future generations should enjoy. In the tentative list, there's a very lengthy list of places, and sometimes we need to consider whether the local entities and citizens make sure that heritage is well conserved if it's in the tentative list. Is this really prompting movement amongst citizens and administrations? If that is the case, then very all good. We are protecting the heritage and making it known. So after 50 years of implementation, maybe we all need to reflect as to how we can help improve the convention. And that's all from me. I think I did abide by the time that you gave me, so thank you so very much, María. It's been a great journey, a great overview of the convention, its principles, and recently in Krakow, Jan Lilusen, the former Secretary General of ICOMOS, he was answering some questions, and he said when they say we need to do a reflection, they're asking us whether we need to change the reflection. He answered, maybe we just need to read it right and follow it adequately. Maybe we don't need anything new. Maybe we just need to stick to the spirit that guided its very beginnings. But thank you very much for sharing all these doubts and all these challenges that World Heritage is now facing. And thanks to the Ministry for representing us so well with the UNESCO. We do our best. Thank you, María. And now, to conclude, we are going to have the official closing of this event that is going to be delivered by Luis Lafuente, Director General for Historic Heritage at the City Council of Madrid. Thank you, Luis. Thank you, Monica. Everything comes to an end. Logically, after 4 intense days of work, we shall conclude this meeting on cultural landscapes that has taken place here in Madrid. Firstly, I'd like to share my gratitude, even though Monica and Carmen were ahead of me. But logically, from the institutional standpoint, thanks are in order. We need to thank all those that made these days possible, starting with Monica, the coordinator, and who has actually devised the contents of these meetings and the works dynamics that have unfolded over these 4 days. Thank you. Thank you to the technical team of the City Council, Carmen, Paloma, Enrique, and Pedro, everyone who made this possible. Of course, thanks to all of our speakers, not just for the efforts required to travel all the way to Madrid so that you could join us here in this meeting. I'd also say thank you for the enthusiasm to participate as speakers, as rapporteurs, or roundtable coordinators. It's not only that you did this very well, you also did it with great enthusiasm. We would also like to thank, from a role of organizers, from the City Council, we would like to thank the company who made this possible, also the interpreters for their work over this past few days. And from the institutional perspective, we would also like to recall the region of Madrid. They haven't just helped us with the organization, they also delivered their presentations regarding the plans that they have in place here in the region. And also we'd like to thank the Ministry of Culture for their collaboration and presence. Thanks, María, Laura, thank you. Also, Arcamas, thank you for your presence and for the support in the organization of this event and your presence over this few days. Several Alcoma's representatives have joined us here, so thank you for that. And finally, last but not least, thanks to all attendees. Thank you for the interest. Thank you for your participation. Quite frankly, it wouldn't make sense to organize these meetings if we couldn't invite people, specialists, people who are not so specialized. Because of the comments that I heard, I think we can qualify this event as a positive one, with very enriching presentations. All the different topics that have been raised have been very interesting, and some will give rise to future discussion too. So we must congratulate everyone for the participation, the work performed in the last few days, and we are therefore satisfied. We will keep an eye on the document that will be released after this, the Madrid Declaration, that I'm sure will be a very important document that will play a decisive role in the future of cultural landscapes. It's been made clear that this category, cultural landscapes, is one with varied and complex assets that require all the necessary study and support to guarantee their best conservation. Thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you again in the second meeting on cultural landscape here in Madrid in 2024. Thank you very much.